Okay, now we're recording. So thank you all very much for coming. This is our first sort of real routing area working group chair training, and we're going to be talking about consensus, specifically driving and judging consensus. Pete Resnick has kind enough to agree to join and do the presentation, and then we're going to lead the discussion. There we go. So the schedule and plan is we're going to talk about scope and objectives, overview and principles, which Pete's going to do, and then do some questions and discussion, which will be recorded. And then we're going to go into the closed meeting, which won't be recorded, and have further discussion, talk about some case histories for the 3 of you who sent in their homework. I hope some of you have actually read the RFC 7282, because I do think it's a really good informative basis. If you haven't, you might pop it up on the screen for scanning. And anyway, we're doing case histories and then the closing discussion, and then we'll talk about what we're going to do for the next meeting and get your feedback. So that's the plan. Basic scope, why are we doing this? But we'd like to get a shared understanding of all the nuances of consensus between our chairs. We'd like to have a discussion where we don't say, oh yes, of course we do consensus, and not pay attention to it. We'd like to understand sort of how different people view judging consensus, what does it mean, why are we doing it, what are the gotchas, because unfortunately consensus doesn't just materialize, right? There can be a lot of work to drive consensus and to make sure that we get solid and active consensus when we're doing things. And one of the keys here is that it's also can sometimes be pretty hard to do consensus, and it'd be useful to have some sort of ideas of what's gone wrong in the past, what's gone right, how you can handle different pieces of it. So in order to make this work, we really want to discuss your experiences, opinions. As we said during the last meeting, for most of this, it's not that we're saying we don't have the knowledge inside the chair. In the routing area, we've got a lot of chairs who have a lot of experience. What we're looking for is to share that experience and to figure out where we do and don't agree in terms of consensus and get some common ideas there. Driving consensus is it's a really critical part of a chair's job. Sometimes you're lucky enough that consensus just materializes, but usually you need to help drive it, to ask the key questions, to make sure the objections get listened to encourage people to speak up when they have concerns, and so on. Obviously, judging consensus is important. It's not trivial. I mean, how to do consensus is rather nuanced. A lot of people don't get it, and it's something that's very judgment-based, and it's personality and people and technical judgment-based. So it's not like we can just give rules for it. If we could, we just would have written code and it would be done. But so anyway, we'll give you the background and support, and then have Pete start going through and talking about some of the different points and starting to sort of prompt you to think about different aspects of consensus. But before I pass it over to him, does anyone have any questions or comments? Okay. Let me get back into the picture. Okay. Pete, would you like to take it away?
Sure, and thanks for asking me to do this. I'm always happy to be proselytizing this stuff. So on this first slide about overview and principles of consensus, the IETF is, leaving aside some of our more processy issues, overall what we're supposed to be doing is producing good technical specs. We're trying to come up with specs that everybody can interoperate with and that we can all implement in a reasonable way. What that means to me is we want to make sure that the folks who are doing the technical work all agree that this is doable to whatever extent we can, because those implementations are the things that are going to have to interoperate. In order to make that work, what we want to do is come to rough, and we'll talk about that in a bit, consensus about those issues. We want to make sure that we haven't missed anything. And in particular, we want to make sure that when issues come up, they are addressed, we understand them, and we make the engineering trade-offs that are necessary. There are going to be some times where people have a complaint or have an objection, and we're going to have to say, well, that's true, but we need to figure out a way to move forward because this is an engineering discussion and an engineering result. We need something that works, not something that's perfect, and that's why we allow for these rough consensus decisions. When you're doing work in the working group, obviously the technical work is going to have to go through these rough consensus discussions. There are some process things that do as well, and I'm going to talk a little bit to some of these because I think we get weird about how we use those consensus processes when it comes to those. But you need to be following the conversation to figure out what the consensus is. So what are the reasons we use consensus instead of doing things like voting or coming up with some other more algorithmic way to figure out the answer? First of all, just about everything in the IETF is this open participation process where you don't know who is and is not a member. So formally voting gets weird because we, of course, would have to figure out who is eligible to vote and for what reason. But I think there's a more important reason we don't go down the path of things like voting, and it's because we don't really care what the numbers are. We don't care how many people are for, how many people are against. What we care about is whether the technical issues have been addressed and whether they've been addressed reasonably. And to leave it to some sort of voting or some sort of other mechanical process opens us up to having those processes gamed, either by stuffing the ballot box, as it were, or by allowing issues to be left on the table even though a bunch of people said, no, we don't care if that issue's left on the table. So we want this based on technical outcomes, not based on just sheer numbers or the way people happen to be gaming the system. So finally, what are we talking about when it comes to roughness? RFC 2418 has this line about 51% isn't rough consensus and 99% is more than rough, and I actually don't buy that principle. As far as I'm concerned, and what I wrote in 7282 was, look, when we talk about rough consensus, what we're saying is the issue in question has been considered, we've talked about it, we've figured out how to accommodate it or how to address it, but we haven't necessarily made a change. We may have said to the person who brought up the issue, hey, look, we get it, we understand it's a problem, but it's an engineering trade-off that collectively in our technical judgment we think we need to move forward with. That could mean that one or more people are left saying, no, 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 you got it technically wrong. But this is why, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, chairs and eventually the IASG and eventually the IAB are in a position to use their technical judgment and say, we've gone through the process of looking at this problem, and we, I, the chair, or I, the AD, or we, the IASG, think that this really technically has been addressed, and we're going to move on and we're going to consider that in the rough. So on the one end, you can't game the system when we deal with rough consensus because you can't do things like stuff the ballot box. On the other end, it relies on the technical judgment of those of us in leadership. And that means that if you do a bad job or we do a bad job, we end up with a crappy document. And we depend on chairs and ADs and the IAB being technically competent and fair-minded and doing the right thing. so let's go on to the next slide. So, when you're, by the way, do pipe up if you have any questions. I'll listen for people unmuting. But we'll have a discussion at the end of this anyway. So, asking questions about consensus. My take on judging consensus, because it has nothing to do with voting, you're not counting up heads or noses or whatever body part you like, what you need to do is, as discussion takes place, the chair needs to say, okay, I think discussion is going this way, and I believe the consensus is such and so, and verify that you know what's going on with the consensus. You can always hear objections, and that may change your opinion about whether you've gotten the consensus right, but what you want to do is listen for where the discussion is going and question. I'm sorry, go ahead. Martin, did you have a question?
No, sorry.
Oh, okay. So in any event, you know, ask the question as you go along and see where the consensus is. So one of the things we tend to do nowadays is at the end of the discussion we have a hum, or we put out a call for consensus on the list and we say, you know, this is the last call, so any, you know, do we have consensus to go forward on this? And I think that's actually the wrong approach. When you want to use a hum, it should be when you actually don't know what the answer is. If you are confused about the discussion, you don't know how the discussion in the room is going at a face-to-face meeting, and you want to say, wait a minute, are there a lot of people or a few people, or what's the move, the mood of the room? That's when to say, okay, let's hum. Which way are we going on this particular issue? For me, that only leads you to, oh, we got a bunch of people who think that going with this solution is the right idea, but a few who don't. Now what I want to do is call the few who don't up to the microphone and say, okay, folks, you've got an issue with this thing that we're going forward with. What are those issues? Because if any of them are really serious issues where the room will say, oh, geez, we missed that, then the room or, you know, the working group in general will need to address those issues or make some changes to the protocol or what have you. So you're using hums to figure out the direction to go. And we'll talk about later if you start getting weird splits. So the other bit here is, well, you know, you can't do those hums in email. What are you doing on the mailing list? One of the things that I push for is when you're having a discussion on the mailing list, you state where you think the consensus is, ask for people who disagree with you. Asking for people who agree with you is kind of boring. You get lots of messages that say, yeah, that's exactly right, but that hasn't helped you in any way. Asking for who doesn't think that we should be going in this direction and give me your reasons is the way to make progress in the discussion. One of the things that I said in the document is what you're looking for the most part, is objections. You want to find out if there are any showstoppers among the issues that people are raising so that you can go back to the group and say, wait a minute, you know, yes, this is a very nice protocol, except we've got an objection out here that says that it's going to cause congestion collapse. What do we do about that? And make sure to circle back and make sure the working group has addressed it. And that addressing it could be, no, it doesn't cause congestion collapse. Addressing it could be, oh, we have to make a change so that it doesn't affect that. Or it might even be, well, we're going to need to put in some text that says the environment in which this occurs won't cause congestion collapse, but if it were moved to some different environment, then it's going to be a real problem and something else would have to be added to the protocol. All of those are perfectly reasonable solutions. What we mostly want to do is avoid voting. We don't want to say how many people want this, how many people don't want this. A, because that will allow folks to gather up all their friends, come into the room and say, no, we don't want it, and now you've got this big, huge number of people saying no, and you don't know why. Numbers of people don't count. Open issues count as far as I'm concerned. Again, you don't need to address all of the issues. You don't need to accommodate all the issues, more to the point. You need to address them. You need to say, yes, we've looked at this issue. But you don't need to accommodate every issue. You can say, yep, we considered that, we've talked about it, and sorry, but we think that the protocol can go forward. It's still technically sound. You want to be, as chair, driving those issues to closure. If someone brings up an issue, and I love issue trackers for this kind of thing, you want to make sure that you've got that issue tracked and you follow the conversation, and at some point you as chair say, okay, this issue's done, we've either accommodated it, we've made a change to the document to deal with it, or yes, we've talked about it, but we've decided not to do anything about it. And close the issue one way or the other. You have to be driving that forward. If you want to declare someone in the rough, you have to say, okay, we've understood this issue. Here are the reasons we think we do not need to accommodate it in the document, and we're moving on. And document that and tell the person why they are in the rough. If someone says, oh, now I understand and I withdraw the objection, that's all well and good, but you've got to be convinced that the issue is closed. If someone just gives up, that's not still being in the rough. Then you've got an open issue without a person attached to it. Make sure the issue is addressed nonetheless. And as I said before, chairs are supposed to use their technical judgment. You can always get it wrong, and getting it wrong can be fixed by someone in the working group saying, you got it wrong, Pete, and you can go back, take a look, and say, yep, you're right, I got it wrong. It can also be fixed by talking to your AD. Someone can say, Pete's just clueless, he doesn't understand the technical issue here. The AD can negotiate that, and if the person really wants to make a formal appeal to the IASG or the IAB, they can do that. That's why we have those chains in place, because we expect people to be making those technical judgments, and we've got a couple of layers of making sure those technical judgments are all right. Again, counting people ain't going to address the issue. You want to hear the concerns and weigh the opinions, and by the time you get to the end of the discussion, you should know what the consensus is and be able to state that. At the end of the discussion is not the time to be asking the question, okay, who agrees or disagrees? Next slide.
Pete, I just wanted to chip in there about the counting people. I think there's something to be said for thinking very hard before asking a question, and think the way I phrased this, might people think it's okay just to say yes or I support? In other words, is my question creating a vote? And if so, go away, think about it some more, and ask the question in a different way.
Yeah, I've got a fun example of this that happened just the other day on an apps mailing list. I actually think, for the most part, the way chairs do calls for document adoption are completely bogus. And we seem to do this all the time. And the reason is because all you get are yes or no answers. Should we adopt the document? A bunch of people say yes, a couple of people say no, and you don't understand the reason behind it. And so you've got 25 people who say yes and 2 people who say no, and, well, what do you do with that information? Well, what you should do is say, wait a minute, those people who say no, what reason would we have for not adopting this document? Is there something in this document that's just architecturally wrong for the thing that we plan to do, and we should start with a clean slate, or we should start with a different document? Or what is it that's objectionable? Which to me says that the question you should have asked from the get-go is, okay, all the people who think this document is the one we should go with, you be quiet, because I think we should go with this too, and I think that's what I've heard, is a bunch of people saying this is the document to start with. What I want to know from the group is who doesn't think we should go forward, and what are the reasons for not going forward with this document? Should we use a different one, or does this document have some problems and we should start over? And ask the question in terms of the objections. And that will get you the information you want. At the end of that, then you can say, it sounds like we've got consensus to adopt this document, and move forward. So yeah, I agree. If the question you're asking is going to come out with yes/no answers, it's probably the wrong question. All right. So, advanced considerations. Let me switch screens here.
Actually, Pete, how do I know it when I see it? Yeah.
Oh, where are we? How do I know it when I see it?
More specifically, by the time you need to ask, you should already know. This is the driving consensus versus calling it, or say, ask, you know, if you're following along on the discussion, if there's been discussion, you can ask about showstoppers, but you should have a sense of what the working group thinks of, what the consensus feels like it is, and you can go and sanity check it. You can say, this is what I think it is, are there issues, etc. But most of the time when it's time to call consensus, you should really already have a sense of what it is.
I've always felt so take the extreme example. Once something comes to an appeal, that should be a sign that something has gone completely sideways in the working group, right? Something got missed that should have been addressed a long time ago. To a certain extent, I feel that that principle goes all the way down. During IETF-wide last call, what we're looking for is, did the working group screw up and miss something? Right? During IESG review, did the working group and the AD go completely off the rails and miss this giant problem that should have been addressed a long time ago? And you as chair, when you're asking those consensus questions, what I think you're doing is saying, okay, it sounds like the discussion has resulted in X. Here's what I think the outcome is. Did I screw up? Did I miss something big? And what you're asking of the working group is, I think I know what the consensus is. Did I miss somewhere? And I think that gets us to true, at least rough consensus. Obviously, you know, when you say those things, if there are issues that were addressed, but there were still people who thought, you know, I think you're wrong on this, you can state in that final question, look, I understand that, you know, Aaliyah still thinks that we should do this using protocol foobar, but I think the working group really addressed that issue. We don't need to do it that way, and so I'm calling the rough consensus for we're going this way. That cover what you were thinking about, Aaliyah?
Yes, thanks.
Okay, good, good. So, moving right along. How to make consensus happen. So, I think one of the things that chairs are a bit chicken about is the applying that technical judgment and pushing and driving the consensus forward. So, what I think as chairs you need to do is say, look, I'm here because I know some stuff about this and I know how to get this group motivated, and one of the things I need to do as a chair is say, okay, I'm hearing these few things, but it sounds like this is the answer. And push the working group forward by suggesting what you think the answer is. If you get wildly good at this thing, sometimes you can even tweak people into saying something and continuing the discussion by saying the opposite of what you think is the right answer. Well, it's sounding to me like we should go with this, stupid choice and go forward that way and see who comes out of the woodwork and make sure that the topic gets discussed. But really what you want to do is drive forward and make sure that the working group is actually coming up and saying when you've got it wrong, and make sure that you drive those issues to ground. You want to walk the working group through it and make sure at the end of the day you can account for all of the issues. That also means that this is a lot of work, so you can use other folks to do this, either by way of, if you want to assign a document shepherd early on to help drive that discussion forward, I think that's a great idea. If you want to talk to a couple of senior members of the, or senior participants in the working group in the background and say, can you push on this issue and make sure that we've gotten some discussion going, I think that's a great idea. So getting stooges is a good thing. You want to push this forward. If discussion is going on like crazy, that's great, but at some point you also have to get in there and say, okay, this has gone on for the last couple of days, and what I'm hearing is X, and make them, make the people who are objecting get up to the front, and the people who are arguing with them kind of lay back for a bit and see if you can figure out if there is still an open issue. All of this said, you do have to account for that there is in fact consensus and not just apathy. So if you've got just a couple of authors who think this document is wonderful and the rest of the working group is snoozing, that's not consensus. You can solicit reviews from folks and get them posting on the list about something in particular, but that kind of, you're enforcing some sort of caring about it, and that to me is always a little dicey. You want to make sure that, yeah, I've gotten reviews of this thing, but if I've got no one who's really interested and no one who's going to implement and no one who's going to do anything, then that's not really consensus. And I want to pick on this a bit. Failure to reach consensus is not a failure. If you've decided that, look, there's really no commitment to this work, no one is going to be implementing this except for the authors, so there's no need for interoperable standards here, this is just a document with no interest, dumping it is a good thing. We produce far too many documents that are, as Ron Bonica used to say on the IASG, HBU, harmless but useless. I don't think that's a good thing. I think that if you find that there is not consensus because there is no actual group of people behind the document, I think you should say, okay, we don't have consensus to move forward with this document, we're going to dump it. And I think that's a fine thing. One of the other things that we run into is people get into the, I've got 50 people yelping that this is a wonderful idea and 50 people yelping it's a terrible idea and we should go with this other wonderful idea. How the heck do I break a deadlock? If you take seriously the idea that this is issues-based, that you want to figure out if there are any showstopper objections to any particular document going forward or any particular piece of the protocol going forward, it actually doesn't matter which one you pick if you've got a pretty even split. So the idea of flipping a coin is fine, and some people, think it's amusing to do so in a room and just flip the coin and say, okay, I guess we're going with choice A. But remember that once you've decided to go with choice A, then you still have to collect open issues on that. If someone comes up and says, well, okay, we've gone with choice A, except choice A will, cause route flapping to happen for the rest of time at such a high rate that it's going to be unusable, at some point you, or maybe the whole working group, will say, you know what, in our technical judgment, choice A, yeah, the coin flip worked, but there's this absolutely showstopper, not going to work issue with choice A. Maybe we got to go try choice B, because we can't fix choice A. And so you can always turn around and go choose the other one. What the coin flip is doing is giving you a start to, okay, let's talk about choice A and make sure that we're okay with that and try and make that our output. You're not saying that the decision was made by flipping the coin. The decision of how to go forward was made by flipping the coin. Sometimes you're not going to ever come to consensus, right? Sometimes there's going to be, you know, just outstanding, serious disagreement with both proposals. And at some point you have to make the call, okay, we do not have agreement in this working group that there is one way to go forward with this. Some people say it's going to break their product. Other people say that the other choice is going to break their product, that they're never going to be able to implement this. We then don't have a standard and we're not going to have interoperability. And again, if we fail to reach consensus, that's not in and of itself a failure. If people are motivated to make it happen, they will either come to consensus or they're going to go off and do their own thing anyway. So it's okay to make that decision that we've not come to consensus. All right, moving on. Is this the last one? I need to check.
Yes.
The last one I'm talking to. Good.
Yes.
Vote stuffing. There's lots of ways that people will try and manipulate consensus. One of the things is bringing all of your friends in and trying to get them to, you know, make noise that, yes, this is a serious objection. In 7282, my last example, you know, I say 5 people for and 100 people against might still be rough consensus. And I think, at least at a theoretical level, that is absolutely true. If you've got a small group of people in the working group who are working on this thing, there seems to be consensus going forward, you're pretty convinced that all of the technical issues are being addressed and or accommodated, and suddenly the one person who is objecting the loudest recruits all of his friends to come in and say, no, I object to this thing, you know, during working group last call. You have to have the ability to look through that and say, okay, are there new issues here, or is it just a lot of people who are repeating the same thing that we've already addressed? And I think this is one of the hardest things for chairs to do, and I'll tell you that it's, you know, if it comes to an appeal, it's going to be one of the hardest things for the IESG to do, is to say, no, we actually did address that issue. And the consensus is still the way that I had it called, even though the number of people that are now objecting is astronomical. And the more credible those people are and the more convincing sounding they can be might make that decision harder and harder. I would claim that once that gaming goes on to that extent, something is so broken that, you know, I mean, it's just completely pathological. We're just in trouble as the IETF if people load it up to that extent that you're having trouble seeing what the true consensus is. And I don't think it happens all that often. But I do know of working groups, one currently existing, where there's a lot of actual attempts to vote stuff, and it's really hard for the chairs to sort that through. But I think it is the job of the chairs and eventually the AD and the IASG to do that. The other kinds of manipulation you will see is repeated, I still think this is an objection. I've been seeing in one group lately someone who repeatedly posts long commentary on a document with lots of little objections. And the thing you need to do is at some point say, all of those things have been addressed, and you're not bringing up any serious new things, and so you are in the rough. You do need to go through those messages and make sure that all of the issues have been addressed, but you know, at the end of the day, you can say to that person, no, sorry, you know, yes, you keep bringing things up, but these are either repeats or things that are just not meeting the technical bar. And at some point, if someone's being abusive that way, we do have methods of dealing with people who are interfering with the progress of the working group. And you can simply cut off their posting privileges. You do need to realize that when that appeal goes to your AD or to the IASG in general, we're going to have to go through those issues that the person is bringing up that they say are not addressed. So we're going to want you to have gone through and you know that the issues are addressed and be able to say that to us. There are going to be times where you are stuck. You know, the recusal issue, you are implicated in some funky way. This is why we give you a co-chair very often. This is why you have an AD. If you get into trouble, there are people to help. And so you need to go to those folks. You can also ask, as I mentioned before, during the conversation, but even at the end of the conversation, other seniors and the members of the community to come in and you know, help drive those discussions. So, and I don't know what else to say about that topic. But in any event, the end result is you do have people to help you drive these things forward, and if people are being troublesome, you have methods to get out of it. We do allow you to cut people off when they're being abusive. And I think, anything else that we talked about, Aaliyah, Adrian, that I've missed?
I think that covers all of it. Thank you very much. Are there people who have been sitting on comments and thoughts and questions or clarifications they'd like to discuss now?
I do. This
Okay.
is Sandy. So
okay.
I have two questions motivated by my own working group. I'm sorry. The first question has to do with, you were talking about the working group chairs judging consensus.
Right.
What about working group chairs who want to enter into the technical discussion?
Yeah, and
what about working group chairs who have questions about one or other of a proposal and don't see anyone asking the question?
So the latter,
what do you do?
The latter, I think, is straightforward, and you should simply do it. You know, this is what ADs do during IASG review. They introduce questions that in their opinion, the working group has not answered. It is part of your responsibility as technical leader to say, okay, we've come to this conclusion, but I see this open issue. Can people talk to whether this issue is addressed or not? And at the end of the day, if you don't think it's been addressed, you do need to have the ability to sort of step back and say, okay, am I in the rough? This is a difficult skill, but it's something that you really need to be able to do. Has everybody considered this seriously? And yeah, they acknowledge that it's an issue, but really what they've said is, we can work around this and you can declare yourself in the rough. But if you think there's an open issue that has not been dealt with at all, I think you should introduce it. And I think that's important for you to do.
Okay.
Now, that said, participating generally in the technical discussion, you can certainly do it. It is certainly well within bounds, but you really have to be careful. You know, in the same way that an AD or an IAB member walking into the room and participating can really drive a discussion way off the rail simply because everybody says crap. The AD thinks this, okay, now we need to go deal with that and make accommodations. And you, in the same way you are part of the leadership, you have to be deft in your use of language and the way you introduce topics and the way you participate in that conversation. And sometimes that means that you're not going to be able to make as loud a claim as you might, but I do think you need to act with care, because people will start to make arbitrary moves to try and simply appease you rather than have a proper technical discussion.
I hear you, but I think there are also cases where the fact that the chair says something can lead to derailing the conversation because there will be a process dispute about the chair said it, and the chair shouldn't be making things.
Right, no, I agree with you completely, and I think this is why you have to walk carefully, and yes, if you are perceived as the chair as trying to manipulate the direction of the discussion, that is a problem, a serious problem, which is why I tend to like to myself appoint chairs who have the technical chops to understand what's going on, but no interest in the outcome whatsoever. There aren't enough of those around to fill in all the chair spots, but people who I really try as much as possible to keep document authors and proponents of a particular technology away from the chair because of that reason. They will be seen as pushing a particular point. You want your judgment to be as clean as possible when you make those consensus calls. Yeah, and if you're doing it right, we'll back you.
Okay. So this cuts into the recusal piece a little bit. Yeah. And you know, you can say, yeah, there are two of us chairing this working group, but for all discussions of this document or this piece of the technology, I am not the chair.
Yes, I understand that. But if there's a working group that has adopted a position and someone is bringing in an opposing position, the fact that you have been chair during the time that one position was adopted, never mind.
Yeah.
Let me get on to the second question. Talking about consensus, and you know, sometimes there's rough consensus and some people just are never going to agree with you. There are some circumstances where the person who is, the group that is disagreeing is in a controlling position in the deployment. There aren't many, but if Cisco said, I am just never, ever going to put that feature in BGP, or if the DNS root server said, we are just never, ever going to deploy this new DNS feature, if they object, even if in your opinion the working group consensus is going against them, what do you do if their position in the deployment path is strong enough that they could, it'd be a maybe useful but still not used. As a, instead of HBU, it'd be some other acronym.
Right. So let's examine when this case might come up a little and what it means. If Cisco says, look, there's just no way we're putting this into our routers, we can't do it, one of the questions you as chair might ask is, why is that? What seems to be the problem here? If Cisco says, look, you know, there is just, we do not have, because of the way we build these things, we will not have the memory in our routers to deal with accommodating this particular feature. That's an objection that the working group really needs to deal with. And the working group may say, yeah, we understand, but screw them. and I think you as chair have to say, wait a minute. If this can't be deployed on a large class of devices for which this working group intends to have it deployed, you can't just say blow off. That's not an acceptable outcome.
Yeah.
So I think you do need to push on the working group and say, yeah, I know, you know, 99% of you think that this is a wonderful thing, but we're hearing it's not deployable, and that sounds right to me, that it sounds like it's not going to be deployable to these folks. And so you haven't addressed the issue. There is not consensus yet, even though a majority of you, a huge majority of you, think we should have this feature. If at the end of the day you say, look, Cisco is just being recalcitrant, and you know, because of some competitive advantage, they don't want to do this. And in fact, in your technical judgment, you think if the working group standardizes this, they're just going to end up doing it anyway. You can declare those folks in the rough. But you've got to figure out whether it's an addressed issue or not, whether the working group has actually walked through it and made a reasonable technical decision, not just on the numbers.
Yeah. Yep. It wasn't a question of the numbers. It was a question of being able to block deployment.
And if you think it's a real technical block to deployment, or even, you know, an economic one, right? I mean, we just can't afford to do that, or we're not going to spend the money on that. Those are issues that have to be addressed by the working group before you can call consensus. If you think it's a bluff, and they're going to go and do it anyway, I mean, boy, I would not want to be in your position as chair if that's what, you know, your working group participants are doing, but I think you can declare those folks in the rough.
Okay.
Any other questions before we go to the closed meeting?
I've got a comment. This is John Scudder. You talked earlier about the, you know, HBU class of document that generates sort of apathy, and it occurs to me, and your comment about that was, well, if there's, you know, basically the authors are going to implement that and they don't even need interoperability at that point, so really who cares if they get a standard or not. There's, of course, a class of document that falls roughly into that, but they sort of need a standard anyway because they need a standards action code point. And I think we can't just ignore those. My inclination is to sort of treat those as there's a different level of consensus required, and that's basically, you know, the working group thinks that this will do no harm, thinks that it is in fact harmless, although it may be useless.
And one of the things that I will channel my illustrious co-area director on this, if you've got a registry that is not going to be harmed by publishing harmless but useless documents, and it currently says standards action is required to register the code point, perhaps the right thing to do is change the registry so that it's simply specification required and stop requiring IETF consensus to get code points when there really is no IETF consensus. And, you know, maybe for the time being you say, yeah, we approve this document because it's going to take a little bit for us to write the document to change the registration policy, but really the answer is change the registration policy.
Yes, I think that that's an easy case to make when you've got a large number space and a harder case to make when you've got a smaller number space. We could probably discuss this at length. I agree with you in general.
Absolutely.
Okay, I'm going to figure out how to end the recording. I'm not sure that thing was.
Same button.
Yes, I know. I clicked the same button. There we go. All right, excellent. So now I'm stopping recording. And